Hello, everyone. My name is Anthony Ojukwu. We are pleased that you could all join us for this week's lecture in Volume 4 of our Neuroanatomy Didactic Series, which brings you lectures from experts in the field covering different topics each week. This series was created by trainees and early career neuropsychologists, including standing members of the Neuropsychology Board, as well as members of the Neuropsychology Committee. Before we start our lecture, one of the main goals of neuropsychology is to provide free, high-quality didactic contents to our audience. Every neuropsychology and neuroanatomy lecture is available on our YouTube channel, so be sure to check it out. Subscribe and like our lectures to get first access to new content. Additionally, neuropsychology works to bring you learning and discussion questions that are provided with specific lecture content. You can access these on our website. Here are the disclaimers for the series. This training is not meant to replace formal education in neuropsychology, and the views of the speakers are their own. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A box on the lower left of your screen, and a recording of today's lecture will be provided on our website and YouTube channel later this week. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jason Gravano for today's lecture titled Functional Neuroanatomy of PPAs, a 2025 update. Dr. Gravano is a clinical neuropsychologist. He earned his degree at the University of Florida, completed his clinical internship at Emory, and completed his fellowship at UC Davis. He is an associate professor at UCSF Fresno Alzheimer and Memory Center. It is so lovely to have you here, Dr. Gravano, and over to you.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to share screen here. Excellent. Okay. So some housekeeping before we get started. This is meant to be a learner anatomy focused talk. There are some concepts that are likely to be kind of looked at with a broad lens rather than in fine detail because of the kind of scope. My apologies in advance for any miscommunications on that. But again, this is meant to be a um, uh, kind of a guiding tour of neuroanatomy of primary progressive aphasias with some updates from recent publications. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, we
Okay.
can. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so no talk would be complete without a brief history. Aphasia syndromes, classically kind of defined in the stroke literature, have nomenclature that is helpful and sometimes a little confusing for learners. I listed this graphic from the little Black Book of Neuropsychology. There's many like it. The idea being we know about aphasia syndromes from focal lesions from stroke and ischemic events. We have a nomenclature from that, and there is some overlap. But a lot of the foundational aphasia work and physiology was from that point of view. How is this different? Well, primary progressive aphasia has some notable differences. It's a degenerative process primarily, and um, it kind of has an evolution. And so the definition of primary progressive aphasia, aphasia meaning without words, lack of words, is a primary difficulty in the usage or retrieval or understanding or comprehension of words, aphasia, and it's principally in language-related functions, though not exclusively, as you'll see. And the cause is a degenerative and progressive one. So the syndromes that we're going to talk about primarily come from observation that um, uh, patients present in some predictable ways. This article from 2004, Gornard-Tupini et al., highlighted some of the discussions in the literature of different presentations of primary progressive aphasia, put it into a neat package in this article with an understanding of a clinical anatomical correlation between these syndromes. So there's syndromes that we'll go into more detail on, but the observation really was that aphasia is not all the same, and that there is some clinical and anatomical overlap. So you can see the anatomical structures. I hope my cursor is coming up. Highlighted in different colors here on the screen, and some more specific, more specific highlighted anatomy is probably important to kind of go over. The expectation being that when I talk about these syndromes, they do have some correspondence to these early identified variants, and so the logopenic uh, variety is a temporal parietal variety, primarily involving changes in the posterior superior temporal gyrus, aka Wernicke's for some. The extension superiorly into supramarginal and posteriorly into angular gyrus, and then inferiorly into posterior middle temporal. And so you have this nice temporal parietal presentation. And then you have what has become known as semantic related semantic variant or semantic dementia, depending on the literatures. That's primarily an anterior temporal phenomenon, and then the non-fluent variety, which is primarily frontal, including areas that are more commonly associated with non-fluent and grammatical understanding. Now, these are the cortical structures that I will emphasize again, that we are not going to go into great detail on some of the other structures that are involved, but it is important to recognize early on that yes, the white matter tracks that connect regions are impacted. For example, in the non-fluent variety here, we have some involvement of arcuate fasciculus and frontal occipital fasciculus, so the white matter tracks that go to and from cortical sites. So we have, again, a cortical anatomy, and we have some indications of other subcortical involvement early in these clinical characterizations. I like to think about when I see these images and blobs on brains, I like to think about some of the training we receive in thinking about unimodal, heteromodal, and limbic association areas. So this is just one graphical depiction of kind of limbic in green, unimodal in yellow, and heteromodal areas. The idea being we have some primary sensory information that then gets kind of further processed in unimodal areas, unimodal association areas, and then kind of integrated into more heteromodal association areas via U fibers, but also other networks. And so this is very helpful for me to keep on track of where I am with these blobs on brains. And so I hope that other learners find this useful as well when we talk about the clinical manifestations and syndromic features. So what's again, a nice blob on brain to kind of start off? We have temporal cortices involving the anterior temporal lobe and nearby structures, including amygdala and parahippocampus and inferotemporal lobes. That's primarily discussed in the semantic presentations, the temporoparietal junctions, which we went over some of the details in just a few minutes ago, and then the non-fluent kind of networks here, which includes again language production centers, as well as kind of the articulatory mechanisms moving the mouth and planning for motor behavior. So the clinical diagnostics are important. This is from Gorno Tempini 2011's definition diagnostic framework for non-fluent logopenic and semantic variants. Again, this talk presumes that the learners have some semblance of familiarity with these topics. I will be using these primarily in the definition so that we can have some continuity in the talk. Um, and so the non-fluent agrammatic variant has some core features, some associated features, and then particular associations with imaging, as well as potentially causal mechanisms. So the Gorno-Tempini article does seem to be widely used and generally, I would say, accepted for these primary syndromes. And so for learners, it's really good to have some fluency with this particular article. So starting with the non-fluent variant, how is this clinically defined? Well, there's agrammatism and language production, which means that the words don't come out in the right sequence and with right references um, when it can spontaneously. And then the second thing here is effortful. So everything is more effortful in producing language and as well as halting with speech sound errors that likely kind of come from apraxia of speech. So these are the core features. They must be present. And the other features here are kind of two of the three. So we have comprehension of syntax at length, so complex syntax, and that probably relates a bit to the kind of the grammar associations here. Spared single word comprehension, so this differentiates it from other syndromes, and spared object knowledge. Again, these two primarily differentiating from the semantic variant. And so the imaging we talked kind of briefly about this highlights some of the diagnostic frameworks and used in research primarily for coming up with this diagnosis. And what does this actually look like or sound like? There's a talk from Northwestern that kind of goes through some examples, and I cherry picked a few for learners today. So this is going to hopefully take us to the right section here.
Reading, uh, picnic, mother drinking glass.
Okay, so we have in the small speech sample effortfulness, telegraphic type speech, and then agrammatism, mother drinking glass. So it's a good, um, very brief representation of what you might expect to see in a non-fluent type presentation. Okay, let me go back to my talk here. Okay, skip a slide. Uh, Again, the anatomy here, you can see there's atrophy and specific pathology, in this case, tauopathy, driving this syndrome in this particular case. So again, a good visualization of what kind of underlying pathology can contribute to the syndrome. It's important to note that the motor features are a bit variable and allowed to be in this framework. So you can have motor weakness and dysarthrias, you can have apraxias of speech, you can have reduced fluency, that halting kind of effortful production. You can have receptive and expressive agrammatism. And of course, the majority of patients in this cohort here, um, or sorry, some, I guess, a minority, but kind of a good overlapping guess of how many people have all of these. It's 30%, whereas you can see the combinations in different orders here. So it's a lot of heterogeneity in the speech language, speech production arena in this particular syndrome. This likely relates to some of the the regional neurologic changes as well as underlying causes of the syndrome. So this is a recent article, 2024, that looks at things like apraxia of speech and the kind of the associated neuroanatomy, which is, there's some insular involvement and infero frontal kind of involvement for that language planning. And then the dysarthric component, which has more of the kind of motor premotor distribution. And when you look at them, when you look at patients that have and don't have these features, you can see some specific presentations that sometimes, though not always, correspond to differences in underlying pathology. For example, people that are like, they don't have much but dysarthria in this clinical sample were more likely to have underlying PSP pathology. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, and that is also within the kind of the motor speech components. All right, next is in the Gorner-Tempini diagnostic article is semantic dementia or semantic variant primary progressive aphasia. What are the main features here? Well, there's impaired naming, impaired single word comprehension. Those are the defining features. And then there has to be three of the four here, which is impaired not object knowledge, so not knowing what an object is. And then having some reading or writing associated dysfunction that maps onto the architecture here. Spared repetition, so it's not so much that they can't articulate the words of phrases, it's that they don't know what that particular thing means. And then broadly, generally spared speech production, grammar, and motor speech. And this is from an older article, but just to demonstrate the idea of what's happening in semantic loss, which is, you can see something and then when you're asked to recall it, this is 10 seconds later. It's kind of like cross-modality interference from the duck, right? So like this is supposed to be a duck, and a person that knows a duck knows that the duck doesn't have four legs, has two legs and two wings. But again, you start to see this kind of regularization of animals and so on. This is classic for this. This one also in early descriptions of semantic dementia. What are some features in conversation and in testing? Again, cherry picked from one of the Northwestern discussions. I'll do two quickly, hopefully.
Let's see what the patient does. At first pass, she was unable to name any of these objects when asked to name them by sight. So now I'm testing the second part to see if she understands the meaning of the words which are the names of the objects. And you see a sheep. And you see a strawberry here.
I saw a strawberry, but I don't see it. Oh, here.
Great. And there's more in this example, but what you see is kind of like fluent, right? I thought I saw a strawberry, but I'm not sure now. And then again, incorrect object identification, right? In both of those examples. So that implies, again, more of a semantic or knowledge-based deficit.
But we can test word comprehension also directly. And here we're asking the patient to define the meaning of these three words that she's asked to read. So she's going to start with lion.
It's lion.
Okay.
And I'm kind of thinking that it was a pill that you take, but I'm not sure that it was lion. Was that.
Okay.
And shirt, again, is what you use on the front of your face, not your face, but in the first of your building to use to get your clothes on.
Can you say it out loud?
It's pumpkin.
Okay.
And actually, I think pumpkin is an animal that you can use to keep them out.
Okay, so you have, again, some good examples of fairly fluent speech with object knowledge difficulties, like pumpkin as an animal, things like that, that suggest no clear hierarchical knowledge of what a pumpkin may well be. And so you also have, again, that spared fluency. We didn't see spared repetition or things like that. but you can see again a couple of quick samples there. The hallmark deterioration and semantic loss in this syndrome is the temporal lobes, anterior temporal lobes. When language is predominant in the syndrome, the left anterior temporal lobe is seems to be disproportionately impacted in majority of cases. Though authors do note again, as you progress in the syndrome, there's bilateral involvement that usually produces more functional deficits and the dementia that comes with this diffuse semantic loss and change. Functional studies do sometimes lend support to the diagnosis. For example, this is a pretty good marker of left temporal hypometabolism. And so this is what you'd want to see if you had access to those things. You also have that knife-like atrophy in that left anterior temporal lobe to kind of map on to that. So this is what you'd want to see in prototypical semantic variant primary progressive aphasias. Astute learners will know that, well, Alzheimer's is also a parietal temporal predominant atrophy pattern. So how to differentiate? It's unclear to me if, again, case by cases can be adequately done. But again, in group studies, it does seem like there are some reliable findings. Primarily, uh, but the cortex just before the hippocampal process. So if you're looking here in the subdivisions of the perirhinal areas, that Broadway area 36 and 35, these are the areas that seem to be uh, perhaps more atrophic and typical semantic variant versus the would be the canonical presentation of amnestic Alzheimer's like change. Okay. Logopenic variant, the last of the three described variants of this particular literature, is a primary deficit in word retrieval, coming up with words for their meaning and getting them out. And there's impaired repetition of sentences and phrases. So it seems like there's a phonologic based core deficit in these disorders. And this presentation has again, speech errors in spontaneous speech that are phonologic in nature primarily, and then spared single word comprehension and object knowledge, again, relatively spared. So they know what it is they're looking at. They just cannot come up with that word, a word retrieval based challenge. And then relatively spared motor speech, which means they don't have a prominent dysarthrias or praxis of speech that count for their deficits. And then again, absence of frank agrammatism. You're not seeing agrammatism leading the way in this clinical picture. All right. Again, some cherry-picked examples from that talk. See if I can get it.
Try this salt trick to eliminate nerve pain almost immediately. Most people think neuropathy is all about damage.
Well, you make pies out of them. They're orange color, and you can carve faces on them for that day of the year. And,
all right, so they're orange in color, and you can carve faces on them. That was this person's attempt to name pumpkin, which they got again in a circumlocucious way. They described what they were seeing, again, implying that they have some semantic knowledge of what's going on, but can't retrieve that specific word.
They've got music here, and he's reading not a card, he's reading a thing, and that's about it.
So in this example, you can see again that the fluency kind of is sporadic because you have good fluency for some portions of the sentence, but stalled on words. That single word retrieval deficit being more obvious in that example. Okay, this is not without critique. Primarily, the critique stems across a couple that are likely interactive or part of the same problem with our clinical pathological syndromes more broadly. So there are unclassifiable and mixed presentations that you will see in clinic. And there's also some miscues with motor speech disorders, like where motor speech leads the way and stays that way, perhaps for some time, like primary progressive apraxia of speech, as some authors indicate. So there are some there's some leakiness here to the categories. And then there's also the acknowledgement that other dementing disorders have clear language-based changes that may overlap with these syndromes. So that's overlap is means that these are somewhat less clear. Um, if we're using them for things like prognostics and functional implications. So, like the atypical Parkinsonisms, can have motor speech problems that don't eventually develop into uh, aphasias and things like that, and then some unclassifiable kind of components to them as well. So uh, BDFTD also has some language related dysfunction on average. So again, these are just harder for these syndromes to parse without critique. And then data-driven approaches don't always match up to these syndromes, though it's primarily because in my brief review is it seems though that the mixed and unclassifiables just keep coming up as hard to delineate within this system. This is an example of some mixed or hard to classify individuals. You can see them individually here with SPECT imaging and the kind of various anatomies that seem to um, be dysfunctional in those cases. So people that don't meet that classic criteria for one of the three syndromes that just have some heterogeneity in their presentations. Okay, so what's the pathology? There's a lot to cover in this, and this is again a very clear overview. Um, so we have a good clinical correlation of semantic changes, semantic variant, primary progressive aphasia, as well as semantic dementia, with TDP 43 type C, so a specific frontal temporal lobar degeneration protein. That seems to really account for a substantial portion of clinical presentations. Logopenic primary progressive aphasia tends to have a more clear association with posterior predominant disorders like Alzheimer's disease, and you'll see in a couple slides things like Lewy body changes and things like that. And then non-fluent primary progressive aphasia seems to correlate pretty well with our for our taus. So FTD, that's related to tau, four repeats, the CBD and PSP in language related areas, later language and speech related areas. And then there's some mixed presentations that I'm not going to go into too much detail, but you can see that some of them are harder to define, Pick's disease and TDP 43A variations. So this is typical because the correlation you'll see here is the biggest chunk of the pie that comes up, this being a combination of these two for our taus and this unclassified for our tau. It does seem like the underlying pathology does lend some heterogeneity in the regional atrophy patterns and perhaps metabolism that occurs in these. And so, always worth a good read to look at how there's some variability in in the syndromes and the underlying anatomy due to the pathology differences that you're seeing here. Same thing for the semantic variant. This is all from this 2017 article from Spinelli. Okay, this is not just a one-off research publication. This does seem to hold true in other research cohorts. So logopenic, again, mostly Alzheimer's, agrammatic, mostly for tau, CBD, and PSP underlying pathologies, and semantic mostly TDP 43 type C. This group went, one level down, looked for differences in presentations of the agrammatic variants, ones with and without apraxia of speech, and it seemed perhaps that Pick's disease maybe has a somewhat higher affinity for regions that are only in grammatic dysfunction versus perhaps again more broad for our tau dysfunction for individuals with grammar problems and apraxia of speech together. So again, it's pretty interesting stuff on how those clinical manifestations could potentially lead you in a direction of underlying cause. I do want to very briefly mention that it seems like there's some challenge in interpreting these, not just because of where the aggregations exist for these proteinopathies, but also potentially where they are in the cortical layer architecture. So there's columns in the cortex, neocortex, and different types. For example, this is just for TDP43. Different types seem to have some different affinities for different cortical layers, which again have implications for cortical to cortical transmission versus cortical to subcortical or from subcortical to cortical input. So again, interesting kind of speculative information here for how different potential syndromes or disconnection syndromes could manifest even with perhaps the same regions of interest. Okay, what do we know about course? Non-fluent primary progressive aphasias tend to progress within the frontal lobes. Broadly, you can see here, semantic tends to progress primarily in the temporal lobes, and then logopenic tends to progress more broadly across different heteromodal spaces. So you can see this again across different cohorts, but again, depending on the time of sampling of the change, it can be harder to see. Survival analyses tend to suggest that some disorders are not as quick in their progression. For example, TDP43C tends to have a longer survival time and differs from other potential causes like Alzheimer's change or 4R taus. So, these potentially are the longer presenting syndromes. So there is some, I think, interest in trying to think about clinical progression and how that may relate to the underlying neuroanatomies, how broadly or closely those changes uh, move. So in Alzheimer's disease, again, we have a temporal parietal predominant pattern, and you can see that the clinical heterogeneity in these individuals. So, the first direction is looking by syndrome, right? And then in pathology, this is again narrowing in on the pathology. And so we have some heterogeneity here based on what we're seeing in clinic. So, some of these presenting with more fluency problems or presenting with other, kind of atypical features. But by and large, these are affecting things like grammar and naming and repetition, like you might expect in this underlying anatomy. Same thing for our TAOs, which is they tend to like to stay with, again, frontal lobes area, but perhaps more involvement of other temporal gyrus dysfunction. And so you, again, see that clinical heterogeneity when you look by underlying disease etiology. PICs, same kind of way you can look at what changes here. Again, ones are typically harder to delineate into one of the stereotypical syndromes or the canonical syndromes, I should say. And so you can see a lot of heterogeneity in clinical presentation with underlying PICs, and the progression tends to be frontal and anterior temporal for these language based disorders from 3R tau. TDP43A, again, another one that's perhaps harder to classify. And again, you have quite a bit of clinical heterogeneity and language function there. And then TDP43C, which hopefully the learners have kept that relatively good correlation with underlying semantic changes. So the good correspondence, not surprisingly, tends to stay and live in temporal lobes with naming and word comprehension problems leading the way. So again, a good clinical pathological correlation there. I don't know too much about the genetics of these disorders, apart what has been described in the literature. I will briefly mention that it seems as though progranulin mutations have the most correspondence to genetic linked primary progressive aphasia, though it's important to keep in mind that majority of cases remain sporadic. As best I know, again, things it seems like a new variant is published on a regular on semi-regular basis. But um, these authors wanted to see, are the genetic variants different from the sporadic variants? And by a large result, there is seemingly a similar anatomy, perhaps with some more progressed atrophy in frontal areas in the progranulin uh, carriers. And they do have a clinical phenotype that seems to be mostly in the non-fluent range. Um, so, as I mentioned before, it's while the majority are sporadic, there are interesting exceptions in these conditions that are familial or genetic. And so you can look for changes not only in progranulin, but also in other FTLD spectrum disorders. Again, they're less frequent, but worthy of curious investigation in terms of clinical presentation and underlying neuroanatomy shared or different potentially. Okay, this is again the progranulin cohort. What's happening is, well, most of them have in this cohort again a logopenic presentation and a non-fluent presentation, but some mixed as well, and even a few, two out of the cohort with a semantic presentation. So again, genetics certainly helpful, and not completely predictive of underlying clinical syndrome. So what are the underlying you know uh, functional neuroanatomy things that are important to remember? Well, we know that the core assessed features of aphasia would be really important to look at. So I'm going to go over a couple of slides that show where differences in anatomy seem to correlate with behavioral measures. For example, this is naming. In this case, there's atrophy in these areas, anterotemporal, and then again some frontal lobe regions tend to correlate with naming problems, dysnomia or anomia rather, and then changes in the anterior temporal lobe as well as other regions, temporoparietal, frontal parietal regions tend to predict progression of that naming difference. This is specific to like the Boston naming test performance across a known interval. You can look also at how this might correspond to naming problems in other etiologies like stroke. This is a comparison attempting to look at what's the commonality and differences in the naming profiles and patterns here. So again, this is a PPA down below, regions in red with action naming. And regions in blue are associated with object naming performance. And this, again, corresponds I would say, very nicely to what you might expect in kind of the functional neuroscience of these uh, investigations with healthy controls to some extent. So again, you can look across different disorders to look for commonalities as well as differences. And cerebrovascular disease is going to be linked to the cerebrovascular architecture and perhaps more than cortical involvement. When there's a stroke, there's the cortex, but also underlying white matter tract involvement as well. So you can, that concordance may be helpful in understanding coronary anatomy. Similar here in naming, this is a different study showing that if you look by syndrome, there may be differences in what's going on that contributes to naming deficit, right? So again, heterogeneity and multiple pathways towards behavioral dysfunction in naming. This is in semantic, again, anterior temporal changes, logopenic variant, combination of changes. Um, to kind of understand what is the primary driver of these naming deficits. It may well vary by um, system that's involved. This is another study that looking at simple kind of verbal repetition tasks, what should be involved, as well as things like we tend to use as behavioral essays of working memory or verbal concentration span. So you have in this article a good model of what might be used for simple repetition, including again, presumably the underlying white matter tracks that connect these regions for efficiency, but a little bit of a difference in things that you might expect, right? Forward span has a superior temporal and some frontal regions. Backwards has a bit more in terms of frontal involvement, which implies, again, more of that executive working memory component. And then in contrast to repetition of words and phrases tends to involve more of a language systems, again, kind of potentially hierarchical, phonologic, semantic kind of needs for repetition in there, or at least lengthy parsing of words and sounds. So again, you have some difference in these two types of measures that commonly look at things like a repetition skill. Next is in sentence production, and not surprisingly, left frontal areas are involved in sentence production across primary progressive aphasia syndromes. And this is, again, accounting for receptive problems as well. And if you're looking for qualitative features and what a person produces, like concreteness or kind of vagueness of speech, not surprisingly, the anterior temporal lobe volume dysfunction seems to predict vagueness in speech. For example, cat, right, would be a very specific naming phenomena, again, spontaneously, but you could be very vague, say that something is doing something, right? It's super vague. And so the more vague answers are likely related, again, to the dysfunction of left temporal processes in typically lateralized individuals. Reading, again, a language-associated dysfunction. There's been some investigations in this in primary progressive aphasias. Primarily, the left superior temporal pole here is seemingly related to some of the surface alexia changes that we see, for example, common and a part of the diagnostic criteria for semantic dementia, right? Like reading yacht as yacked. So accurate phonology if they didn't know what the word was, because it's kind of an atypical word, but not linking it to, oh yeah, yacked. No, that's yacht because it's something I've recognized before. It's that atypical um, uh, relationship between the speech sounds and the word meaning. So the phonological alexia, though, reading disorders that relate to kind of miscuing in phonemes tends to be, again, that temporal parietal dysfunction that leads the way in those disorders across PPA syndromes. It's important to recognize that there are some suggestive features that relate to language behavior dysfunction, for example. Um, this is a study of patients with echolalia and that tendency to repeat what's been heard in the environment. This study, I'd say not particularly or surprising, or I should say more consistent with what you'd expect is localizing to areas of the frontal lobe that tend to have more of that self-generated motor um, need. So you have this idea that there's some endogenous versus exogenous initiations of movement and in speech, and so when people have the kind of their endogenous system is not doing so, they might have a perceptive element there. So again, pretty interesting to think about how that interacts with these systems. There are, of course, ways of looking at these systems by looking at our behavioral tests and assays in combination with each other, as well as with kind of the understand that some of them may overlap in what's being required, right? So there are no process peer measures, so you're trying to figure out what is really going on in these syndromes, and so this is a good kind of investigation into things like the sentence comprehension, grammar kind of structure, single word recognition, semantic problems, and phonology needs. And so this is how these investigators consider the hub versus kind of process integration. They label modularity and granularity in these processes to kind of get at a behavioral output and what you're actually seeing and what the person is going through internally. Challenges to understanding primary progressive aphasias tend to include a variety of thematic elements, which is because it's such a it's a long and drawn out process over many years for some disorders like semantic changes. It allows for reorganization of those systems with new learning and other sorts of things. So we presume not only that that we're seeing is a deficit of the anatomy not functioning properly, but also the reordering, restructuring of that anatomy here, was being just one example of a conceptual application of that with some connectivity analysis. These types of descriptions and understanding of reorganization um, can have some pretty interesting associations with things like creativity, artistic creativity, and so on. And so, uh, you know, it seems like it's worth looking at connectivity pattern changes, so not just regions of interest, but how these work between and within syndromes. Of course, that has been looked at in a variety of ways. This is one example. You're looking at logopenic, semantic, non-fluent as compared to controls. You can see in each of them there's within language disruptions, and to some extent, the visuals map onto how you might expect that to work, but also an interesting hyperconnectivity or change in process the other to kind of so hyper and hypoconnectivity to other broad networks. So you start to think about how these language disruptions and the cortical sites, when they have overlapping anatomy with other cognitive functions and also integrations with other circuitry and stuff, start to kind of play out a little bit more on the widespread circuit level. This is, again, another recent example using some EEG to look again at functional connectivity changes across different networks that are commonly associated in cognitive neuroscience literatures, like the default mode network and salience network, and trying to understand how these syndromes leave these other networks and how they may impact them directly. There are some other challenges like how do you parse this difference in structural versus functional analyses? Atrophy seems to be a tried and true method, but there's some implications and suggestion that functional changes may precede or inform additional dysfunction. So you could look at EEG or other functional measures, metabolic measures, and so on. It's kind of hard to know the sole way to go. And people have been attempting again more combinations of these to try and understand the network dynamics that accrues in these disorders. Next is that within versus between challenge of primary progressive aphasias, which really means that, are you looking across all of them together and getting variants from that, or are you looking between them and kind of isolating the syndromes and trying to look at differences between syndromes? So those kind of methodological approaches have different implications for how you read the data. And then, obviously, like some of the structural versus functional stuff, there is literatures on, what might make you more sensitive or less sensitive to change. And so there's things, including partial volume effects and the corrections thereof that make it harder to see, clinical imaging. All right. Individual variability in course is also a potential challenge in understanding changes. We know that there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in course, and these authors took, I think, advantage of this, showing that people that have preserved hippocampi and parietal lobes in terms of didn't have as much atrophy there, tended to do better in a training that focused on language and language support. So the implication being that people that don't already have dysfunction in those kind of broader systems might do better or might do better with rehabilitative approaches. Again, this is, I think I've already talked about this, the idea of mixed presentations. A lot of researchers aren't quite sure what to do with the mixed presentations, some of which align with the clinical pathological entity really well, and others that like look like one but have a different underlying pathology. And so it's a matter of empiric investigation to see how these mixed presentations are dealt with and if they can be informative. There's also a tendency to focus on the cortical sites, but it is important. This is just an example. Important to remember that that there are hippocampal and subcortical dysfunctions as well in these syndromes. So there's some. This is just a breakdown of FTD TDP-43 syndromes and where the pathology is in the hippocampus, subcortical regions, as well as the neocortex, which may again kind of give us some indication as to what clinical phenotypes are showing up in clinic. So while primary progressive aphasia is a primarily language-based disorder, it is not without cognitive and behavioral changes beyond that, and that even fairly early on in the course. So there has been some interesting attempts to understand clinical progressions of the th three syndromes. These are, I think, worth reading, trying to understand at different stages where a person might be experiencing symptoms and what area the canonical syndromes that we've discussed before. This is a quick graphic, not to be memorized or look into detail, but just show how they approach this at different stages. There's different common symptoms that are neurobehavioral, that are cognitive and beyond language presentations. And so with that, how do we deal with that? Well, we know we can look at them between, right? Between syndromes. So logopenic, and non-fluent and semantic tend to have different trajectories in terms of their deficits and other cognitive functions, including attention-based difficulties, memory-based difficulties, cognitive fluencies, and visual spatial-based challenges, based again on their anatomy, their proximal anatomy to other cortical regions, as well as the dual function of those language regions within cognitive uh, other cognitive systems. So we have again different trajectories in everyday skills, right? Logopenic and non-fluent and semantic shown here again everyday. So there's some similarity here. Abnormal behavior seems to occur more frequently in semantic changes that temporal lobe and perhaps orbital frontal kind of change seems to be implicated. Mood and there are other neuropsychiatric changes again seem to have some difference by syndrome. So, how can you use this in research and understanding the anatomy? Well, you can understand the overlap of language areas with their cognitive underpinnings. This case looked at naming systems and repetition, phonological loop type systems in logopenic primary progressive aphasia. So you're looking at some of like the overlaps and differences there. So not surprisingly, when you have involvement in systems that tend to be producing naming deficits versus fluency deficits, you can have some heterogeneity in an individual because where their pathology is localizing may explain, may be disrupting one or the other of these cognitive processes. This is an attempt to, I think, to show some of the factors that might be influential in understanding a presentation with cognitive impacts. For example, like general cognition, so like kind of this idea of, their PPAs do, progress to everyday dysfunction and dementia diagnosis. Other things that may be specific to like semantic loss as well as working memory loss, again, tend to pan out in the specific, uh, I think, cognitive connectivities of these areas. So really all this is to show that the cognitive networks that support these language that these language skills are disrupted as well. And so you can see that again in broad functional assessments. This is another example for visual spatial changes that in primary progressive aphasia. Um, and so what are you seeing? Well, you see that there's some linkage to executive-like functions, memory-like functions, and primarily motor-based functions that come out in uh, statistical analysis as being um, perhaps prognostic of those changes. So you're seeing broader than language change insofar as those other networks are being disrupted. Same idea with this one, highlighting that logopenic primary progressive aphasia tends to, due to its affinity for this temporoparietal junction, disrupt a lot of different underlying cognitive dysfunctions. And so you can see again a map, an attempt to kind of categorize these by level of severity. For example, math tends to be impaired and logopenic, not as much in the other disorders. And that's again likely due to this regional affinity um, where calculation, disorder also tends to live. Executive dysfunction does seem common enough. My understanding of the literature is that logopenic and non-fluent tend to have more of executive processing deficits, executive function deficits, not necessarily behavioral, whereas semantic tend to have like these behavioral, what you consider behavioral executives. So the cognitive executive systems tend to be preferentially disadvantaged in these. And when you're reading the literatures, it is helpful to keep that in mind. Is this a cognitive executive problem or is this a behavioral executive problem? And what might that mean for the underlying anatomies? Emotional communication disorder is something of interest to me. And what this quick diagram shows is that yes, there is a change in emotional perception, so the Ekman phases of emotional expression, um, and they don't necessarily overlap with the regions that are associated with cognitive disruptions. Um, and so you could see that again here as well. So the top panel here is non-fluent, right? So again, you have that frontal predominant change. And then the bottom is logopenic. And so what you're seeing is the regions associated with Ekman, which is the emotional processing, there's a right hemisphere association with areas that are, again, homologous to language networks in the left hemisphere that probably underlie this emotional communication problem, but it varies by the syndrome. Similarly, researchers have attempted to decompose complex phenomena like apathy, looking cognitive, executive, and emotional aspects of apathy, mirroring what I think has been done in other subcortical with subcortical disorders like Parkinson's and so on. So the idea of this paper was to try and see, is there a difference between these syndromes in their apathy and the regions of interest in neuropathic change that underlie them. So their conclusion was yes, that there's differences in the different types of apathy profiles, and that this may relate to underlying changes or differences in the syndromes, as well as perhaps some shared commonalities in the overlap of uh, the anatomy. Similarly, you can look at complex things like eating behavior change. This is again common in semantic dementia, particularly. Food fads, narrowing of preferences, some compulsivity around eating, and so you can look at those different changes. And in this case, as has been shown in other research studies of the same types of changes. You're seeing, again, an anterior temporal and orbital frontal anatomy to changes in eating behavior. So you can again look at the language-based changes in primary progressive aphasia. You can look at the other regional changes that underlie neurobehavioral and cognitive systems to really understand these complex presentations and phenomenon. Um, and you can also again look at it from a different point of view, which is a uh, specific pathology-based pathology first focus, which completely upends this talk, right? Because we took a syndrome primary focus. You could do the same kind of work with looking at underlying pathologies and the heterogeneity within them and how they present behaviorally. Okay. So the citations are embedded throughout. I hope that it prompted some interest at the very least in learners trying to understand a bit more about how you can understand the clinical neuroanatomy of primary progressive aphasia as it relates to language as well as other disturbances. And there are several really good reviews. I just picked one that I am biased towards to understand what we're talking about as the considerations and understanding how this disease and the syndromes that characterize it can be informative for neuropsychologists, understanding brain and behavior relationships. Okay, so that's my time. I apologize for not giving too much time. I'm willing to stay on a little bit longer for questions and answers for this talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gravano, for such a wonderful lecture. It was really lovely hearing you teach us today. Everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Gravano. And thank you all for attending today's lecture. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but please reach out to Dr. Gravano if you have additional questions. You can always look up by getting his name from our websites and our YouTube and etc. So this brings us to the end of today's lecture. And please join us next week, Monday, as we learn about the neuroanatomy correlates of behavioral and psychiatric symptoms in frontotemporal dementia, where we use mapping brain body relationships. Do have a lovely week ahead, everyone, and bye.